Good evening and welcome to this very special Dunham Bible Museum lecture on Lincoln and the Bible. Last fall, we established the Dunham Bible Museum lecture series as an important part of the Dunham Bible Museum to show the Bible's influence and impact on every single area of life and culture. So many times today in our secularized society, religion and Christianity is just excised, and many have forgotten the truth of how Christianity has affected so much of the foundations of our Western civilization. And this lecture series was established to remind us of those truths. And we are very privileged to have with us today, as part of the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth, Ronald White, whose book, A. Lincoln, is now on 10th place in the New York Times bestseller list. Ronald White has tremendous qualifications for writing this book. He is a PhD, has a PhD from Princeton Cemetery. How about that? From Princeton Seminary. He also is professor, do you think I'm going to remember anything after this? Professor Emeritus from San Francisco Theological Seminary. He's visiting professor at UCLA. He has taught at Princeton Theological Seminary, Whitworth University, Fuller Seminary, many others. He has spoken at the White House. And one of the most wonderful things, he is a fellow at the Huntington Library, where there is a vast collection of Lincoln notes and items. He is the author of 8 books, including The Eloquent Lincoln, A. Lincoln, and Lincoln's Greatest Speech, which is about Lincoln's second inaugural. And you have Lincoln's second inaugural in your program, which I'm sure you'll want to look over. A number of years ago, Dr. White said this: people don't deal with Abraham Lincoln's religion. It's the great whole in our study of him. And thankfully, he has filled that hole and is going to help us today understand more about Lincoln's religion and how the Bible impacted his thinking. Dr. White.
Diana only said what many of us have said. I was being interviewed on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer, and he began by introducing me as from San Francisco Theological Seminary. We had to stop the tape and start over again. It's a real privilege and a delight to be with you this evening. Diana and I have been talking about this presentation for 15 months, and she has filled me in on the vision for the Bible Museum. This afternoon I had the privilege of taking my own private tour. I taught a class last fall at UCLA called A History of Religion in the United States, and I began by saying, very much in the spirit of your introduction, there's an elephant at UCLA. We all know the elephant is here, but we have conspired not to talk about him. It is the subject of faith, of the Christian faith. Oh, we will cross the line between church and state. Oh, my goodness, we will start proselytizing. How terrible. And the museum declares so boldly, I love the panel in there, if you've not seen it yet, of how she has set up the way that the Bible is prominent in the charters of so many of the 13 colonies, right in their constitutional foundation. And so I'm delighted to be here to try to fill in a little bit of the hole. She's given me my class assignment. It is to talk about Lincoln and the Bible. And certainly in this bicentennial year, a bright light has been shown on Abraham Lincoln. I received a call about 12 weeks ago from the State Department asking me if I would speak about Lincoln in Germany and Italy. And I said, why? Oh, they said the Europeans are absolutely fascinated by Abraham Lincoln. And we would like to put our best foot forward as Americans and tell this story. So there's a deep fascination. Certainly our President, Barack Obama, has shown another light on Abraham Lincoln, all to the good. But the remarkable thing is that in the shadows is the story of Lincoln's journey of faith. It has been underplayed, if often even obscured. And so even Christian people are not fully aware of this journey and how his journey of faith can be important for our discipleship of faith in our own day. That's what I'd like to talk about. First, we need to understand his story. Born on February 12, 1809 in Kentucky, he was raised in what was then called a separate Baptist tradition. There were three major Baptist traditions in Kentucky as he grew up. He moved with his family at age 9 to Indiana. There his father helped build the Little Pigeon Baptist Church. His mother joined by experience, as the record said. His sister Sarah joined, but he did not. Unusual for a family. Lincoln, who had that kind of side of him, would listen to the sermons, and then he would go out and stand on a stump and mimic the sermons of the preacher until his father brought him down and sent him back home. I think Lincoln, like some young people, somehow had to push against, maybe it wasn't even the Christian faith, it might have been his father with whom he had a very conflicted relationship. He pushed against his father's vocation, farming. He pushed against his father's politics, Jacksonian democratic politics. He pushed against his father's faith, and he had to go on his own way. He had to find a faith that was more rational. He was worried that the faith of his parents was too emotional. It didn't allow the questions that he wanted to ask. And so he became, as many young adults become, he became a scoffer, even a skeptic. When he moved to the little village of New Salem, many people remembered, and I think it probably is true, that he had written a paper attacking revealed religion. He had been reading some Enlightenment thinkers, and before he could finish reading it, one of his friends ripped it out of his hand and tossed it in the fire, because this wasn't the sort of thing that an aspiring politician in the 1830s ought to be talking out loud about. And then the biographers or historians tell us that Lincoln became a fatalist. Fatalism was kind of a kissing cousin of deism. It was the God of Thomas Jefferson. You recall, or you may not recall, that Thomas Jefferson went through the Bible and literally cut out with the scissors all of the miracles in the New Testament. Jesus was a moral teacher, but he was not the Son of God who died on the cross for our sins or who was raised to a new life. So this was fatalism was something like this: God is the watchmaker who puts the world in motion, but is not the God who enters into history in the person of Jesus. Well, and that's unfortunately where many of the biographers stop. But like your faith journey and my faith journey, Abraham Lincoln's faith journey did not stop, and it kept on going. And like many of us, I think, when we enter into our full adult years, whether we want to or not, tragedy intersects those years, suffering intersects those years. For Lincoln, it was first the death of Eddie Lincoln in 1850, and he turned to the young pastor in Springfield, James Smith, who had just been there a few months. The Episcopal minister was out of town, the minister who had married them, so they asked James Smith to conduct the funeral. And they struck up a relationship with him, this thoughtful minister of the old school Presbyterian church. The Presbyterians, like the Baptists, like the Methodists, divided in the years before the Civil War. And the old school were the kind of rational Presbyterians who did not believe that the church should be involved in politics. The new school was the more experiential, who were very strongly anti-slavery. Lincoln chose the old school, the rational James Smith, to be his pastor. But he never joined the church. Mary did, and they had a pew, $50 a year. But Smith produced a book called A Christian's Defense. It's a long book. We've got a copy of it at the Huntington Library, about 800 pages. It's a defense of the authority of Scripture, both Old and New Testament. And Robert Lincoln, the eldest son, remembers that that book had a central place in the bookshelf at their home at 8th and Jackson. So Lincoln read this book, A Christian Defense of the Bible. Then in my new biography, A. Lincoln, I pick up the story of Lincoln the President, and I suggest that the missing person in this story is his pastor, Phineas Densmore Gurley. For so many of us, we need a pastor, we need a mentor, we need some spiritual guide. Gurley had finished first in his class at Princeton Seminary in 1840. He was a student of Charles Hodge. He was the old school Presbyterian. Lincoln said of Gurley, "I like Gurley. He don't preach politics. I get that every day of the week. He preaches the gospel. And so Lincoln became more and more regular in his attendance at New York Avenue. He even, towards the end of the war, started attending the Thursday night prayer meeting. Often besieged by office seekers, Gurley would set up a system where Lincoln could sit in the doorway of Gurley's office, and he'd keep the doorway of kind of the basement chapel open. And the prayer meeting was prayer, but it was also preaching, and so Lincoln could listen to Gurley's sermons. And I have read Gurley's sermons in the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia, and you can hear Gurley's words in Lincoln's words. Most especially, in February 1862, Willie Lincoln died, the second Lincoln boy to die, the boy most like the father. Mary Lincoln, I'm sure, never fully recovered. This was the beginning of the downward spiral of her life. And so Lincoln invited Phineas Densmore Gurley to come to the White House to deliver the sermon. And in the middle of that sermon, which is a remarkable one, Gurley is sort of wrestling out loud with the eternal question between God's will and human ability in the middle of a funeral sermon. But finally he leans forward, I think he did, and said to Abraham Lincoln, "In your grief, I ask you to trust in biblical providence." Biblical providence. Dear friends, providence is our belief that God is a God of personality. God is a God who loves us. God is a God who acts in history. So I'm going to say tonight that Lincoln is no fatalist. In fact, I discovered another interesting book. The historians say, well, fatalism and providence and perhaps predestination is a straight line. No one in the 19th century would have ever believed that. For in 1859, Francis Wharton, an Episcopal minister in Ohio, who would become one of the first professors at the new Episcopal Seminary in Cambridge, Massachusetts after the Civil War, wrote a book called Varieties of Unbelief. And right in the middle was a chapter on fatalism. For Wharton, fatalism was not on the line from of predestination and providence. It was unbelief. Why unbelief? Because it did not believe in a God of personality, a God who enters into history in the incarnation of Jesus, a God who loves us. So at the end of our time this evening, we'll be looking at the second inaugural address, and I'll already clue you in, this is not fatalism. The second inaugural address is biblical providence. A little bit about, therefore, Lincoln's biography. Like many of us, he pushes against his parents. He goes his own way as a young adult, and then I suggest that he reappropriates elements of the Christian faith back into his life as a mature adult, but he can't quite appropriate the faith of his father and stepmother. It has to be a little bit different variety. It's an old school Presbyterian variety where he can trust the thoughtful, rational preaching of Phineas Densmore Gurley. Well, there's three charges that I've heard against Lincoln in all of my touring across the country. First of all, Lincoln was not a religious person. And that is based on the fact that it is true Lincoln never joined a congregation. But I've just told you in sketching quickly his biography, it is that he affiliated in many ways with two congregations, both in Springfield and Washington, old school Presbyterian congregations. The second charge is that, and I've been told this many times in the guise of questions. Once a congressman in Washington said to me, he lectured me, don't you know that Abraham Lincoln's use of the Bible is nothing more than what a cultured person would do in the middle of the 19th century? Just like a cultured person would quote Shakespeare. Don't read anything more into it. If at best, it's simply the Bible is literature. He's extracting quotations from the Bible because that's what people did in the middle of the 19th century. Possibly wrong. What about Lincoln's personal use of the Bible? He only had 1 year of education, less than 1 year of formal education. Just incredible. He became a self-educated person, and not just simply as a teenager or a 20-something, but through his whole life. And so the primer for him was the Bible. This is where he first learned to read. And I discovered in preparing this biography that the grammar that he used, the Kirkham Grammar by Samuel Kirkham, I discovered that Kirkham was an English clergyman. And the way that he taught his grammar was this. He would say, now this is a word with one syllable, and he'd use a Bible verse from the Psalms. This is a word with two syllables, and he'd use another Bible verse from the Psalms. This is a word with three syllables, and he used another verse from the Psalms. And so what Kirkham was doing very self-consciously, but it seems to have been missed by most of the biographers, he was teaching moral education. He was teaching grammar for sure, but he was imparting moral education. So Lincoln grew up with the Bible. He also had a practice that was common in the 19th century. I wish it were more common today, and that was the memorization of Scripture. I recall as a young person, really nurtured by the ministry of Young Life, that we would memorize the kind of B-ration cards from the navigators. And then I got to my sophisticated self at about age 15 or 16, and I said, oh, this is nothing but rote memory. Now, we don't want to do this anymore, and that's what I heard throughout the church. This is nothing but rote memory. Well, there's nothing wrong with rote memory. Rote memory is the basis by which people in concentration camps in Germany were able to survive. It was how my friend Ben Rice survived 4 years of captivity in Lebanon when the terrorists took him captive. And he had nothing in his hands, but he had in his heart and his mind the Bible. And he called the Bible forth from rote memory. And of course, rote memory is the foundation by which you and I would interpret the Bible, would struggle with the meaning of the Bible. So Lincoln memorized whole portions of the Bible. As an adult, he had a favorite practice. This was his sense of humor. People would just kind of quote the Bible to each other, in everyday conversation. And when they quoted it a little bit wrong, Lincoln would quote it back to them right. He just loved this kind of give and take. They would say it, but not quite correctly. He'd say it correctly. He knew the Bible so well. What's also missed is that there are multiple witnesses that Lincoln read the Bible. One has to be very careful in reminiscence. I have been with many Christians and Christian groups when people will tell me things, and it's such a wonderful story, but, for example, if you go to Washington, D.C., if you walk into the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, you will hear that Abraham Lincoln, who was shot on Good Friday and died the day before Easter, was ready to join the New York Avenue Church on April 16, 1865. I might wish that were true, but on what basis do we know it? Well, Gurley died in 1868. His daughter said in 1896 that her father told her that Lincoln was going to join the church on April 16, 1865. Possibly, but that's a long time after that she suddenly remembered that her father had told her this. So there has been an attempt to Christianize Lincoln, and this, I think, is one of the reasons that the scholars are turned away from this. We had a whole spate of books written by preachers who used this kind of reminiscence very, very uncritically, and therefore the secular scholars have sort of put arm's distance. But we don't need to put arm's distance because there are some very reliable witnesses. When the Lincolns moved into the White House, the very first day they were introduced to the Taft family. And the Taft family had 2 or 3 rambunctious boys who came over to play with Tad and Willie, but they had a delightful girl who was 16 years old, Julia. And she struck up conversations with Abraham. And she wrote a wonderful book later in life called Tad Lincoln's Father. And in that book she recalls how she would sit with Lincoln at lunchtime, and Lincoln would sit back in his big rocking chair. He'd take his shoes off, and Mary didn't like that, so she had a servant quickly come and say, "Put slippers on the president's feet." And she would recall how Lincoln would read the Bible, his it wasn't the ceremonial Bible that we saw at the inauguration. That wasn't Lincoln's Bible. That was bought by the clerk of the Supreme Court for that occasion. But Lincoln would take out his old battered and tattered Bible and read it. And she recounts the conversations between, she was 16 and he's the president, and she said, "Oh, you're reading," and all this goes on. After Willie Lincoln died, Rebecca Pomeroy came into the White House as a nurse to help take care of Mary. And she recalls the same thing. When you're, as an historian, you're looking not for one witness, but for more than one witness. And so she recalls talking with the president, and he asks her, Miss Pomeroy, what are your favorite portions of the Bible? Oh, she said, I very much like the Psalms. Oh, he said, that's my favorite portions. And then he would quote whole Psalms back to her. Well, the newest sight to see Lincoln in Washington, and if you have this opportunity, I really encourage you to do so, is the so-called President Lincoln's Cottage. It was opened in September of 2007. Lincoln had his own Camp David, so to speak. It was the soldiers' home, 3 miles north of the Capitol, 3 miles north of the White House. He would travel there he was a commuter. He would travel there at night by horseback or by carriage and come back in the morning. At first he traveled by himself, and one day someone took a shot at him, and his horse bolted and ran all the way to the soldiers' home, and he kind of made light of it. And so finally they began to have a military detail to accompany him. I mean, he was riding out there by himself, the President of the United States. Well, in recent years, a wonderful, I want to get his name straight here, David Derrickson was a captain in the Pennsylvania military who was in charge of the detail bringing Lincoln back and forth. And he writes in his diary, I would often arrive early in the morning, very early in the morning, and invariably I found the president either reading the Bible or reading some manual on military theory. So we have multiple witnesses of the use of the Bible in Abraham Lincoln's life. Perhaps the story that strikes home most to me is the story in the summer of 1864. Joshua Speed was his greatest friend, his dearest friend. They had met in Springfield. Then Speed moved back to his home in Louisville, Kentucky. And Speed now came to the so-called soldiers' home, President Lincoln's Cottage, in the summer of 1864. And as he walked in upon Lincoln, he saw Lincoln reading the Bible. And he said to him, oh, I see that you are profitably engaged. And Lincoln replied, I am profitably engaged. And Speed said, well, that's remarkable. I can remember the day when both you and I were skeptics. And Lincoln walked over and put his arm around Speed, and he said, Speed, take all of this book that you can upon reason and the rest upon faith, and you will live and die a happier and better man. Now, some of the scholars, I heard one, I won't identify him, say, I can't believe that story. Why can't you believe it? Speed wrote it in 1867. He was still a skeptic. He had no reason to try to Christianize Lincoln or to lift up the reading of the Bible because he was a skeptic. I find it to be an absolutely authentic story of Speed recounting his dearest friend's conversation about the Bible. Most remarkable of all is the charge that Lincoln, when he did mention the Bible in public, did so only as a shrewd politician, recognizing that he was speaking in the middle of the 19th century to a largely religious audience. I can identify that with a bit. I watch at times with you how every single American politician today of both parties feels it incumbent to quote the Bible or to make some religious gesture, when I sometimes wonder how genuine is this? And so that charge has been asked of Lincoln. So I've put into your hands this evening the second inaugural address. This remarkable address, the most profound address in the whole American story of the role of God in American history, of the way that we combine religion and politics. Yes, we've separated church and state, as well we should. We have never separated religion and politics. So in this address, I ask us to pay a little attention to it. It's going to become interactive now. I want to ask what's going on here. When I turned to Lincoln not that many years ago and initially turned to this address, my academic friends said, well, don't get too excited. Every American president will, of course, invoke the name of God, and, of course, they will quote Scripture. So I decided to test out that theory, and I read the 18 inaugural addresses delivered by 14 presidents in the years before Lincoln. And I discovered that, yes, every one of them had named the name of God in some rather ingenious ways, but always in the last paragraph, always. It was as if they were saying, in effect, and we need God's help too. Lincoln mentions God 14 times in the second inaugural address, 701 words, the second shortest inaugural ever offered, and none of the times are in the last paragraph. They're in the central, foundational, third paragraph of the address. This is not window dressing. This is not illustration. These are the pillars by which he is giving us his address. Then I was told that every American president always quotes the Bible, and if you think of recent inaugural addresses, you would have to say, well, that's true. But in the first 18 inaugural addresses, I was surprised the Bible was only quoted one time in 18 addresses. John Quincy Adams, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. But he said it in the fourth paragraph. Lincoln will quote the Bible 4 times, twice from the Old Testament, twice from the New Testament, and then he will invoke prayer 3 times. Once upon a time, in speaking at a church, the Saturday night in a moment of weakness, someone said to me, "You'll be willing to give the children's sermon too, won't you, tomorrow morning as you preach?" And I somehow said, yes. And just before we walked into the service, the woman minister leaned over to me and she said, "You do remember that you're giving the children's sermon?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I do remember." So the children sat down in front of me and my mind was whirring. And I remembered how Lincoln prayed. Noah Brooks, who would have become his secretary in the second term, arrived from Sacramento to begin covering him for the Sacramento Daily Union. Brooks was sitting in the balcony at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. And when the minister called for prayer, he looked down in this large congregation, and several men, including 6'4" Abraham Lincoln, stood up to pray. And he asked him afterwards, sometime later, "Why did you stand up?" He said, "It's my mark of respect." He said, "I always call God the Almighty. So how can I not stand up? Because of my respect for God." I later learned after the service that the teacher took the children back and she said, "Well, now today, children, let's talk about prayer." And they all said, "Let's stand up." You know? So we're not talking about prayer tonight, I know, but I think there's another remarkable story here is Lincoln's prayer. He was a praying person. Let's look at this address together. Oh, we could spend the whole evening talking about it. I'll just make a comment on the first and second paragraph. The first paragraph, Lincoln breaks all rules of modern leadership, which is usually to sort of hype what you're going to do, to list very optimistic predictions by doing exactly the opposite. He begins in the first paragraph in line 1 by saying there's less occasion for an extended address. Line 5, little that is new could be presented. The last line, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. He wants to diminish expectations. Then in the second paragraph, we begin to get a sense of what he's doing almost alone. The preachers were not doing it. He's asking himself the question, how can the South be brought back into the Union? And he understands if the South is meant to bear the blame and the shame, they will never be able to fully be united in the Union again. So thinking in the future tense, he begins to use inclusive language. All thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dread it. All sought to avert it. The third line from the bottom of the second paragraph, both parties deprecated war. The greatness of Abraham Lincoln was that he imputed the best possible motives. He said, if I lived in the South, I would think as they do. I would act as they do. On another occasion, if I lived in the South, I wouldn't have any idea how to get rid of slavery. The capacity to put himself in the shoes of other people and to say, let's start talking about all and both. Let's stop this divisive talk. Let's bring people together. Well, then, in the middle of the third paragraph, it's line 8, Lincoln does something quite dramatic. He says, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God. Lincoln is now signaling to his audience that he's going to think theologically with them. And he does so at first inclusively. Both read the same Bible. Diana, you were asking me where I did my research, and I said the Library of Congress and the Abraham Lincoln Museum, but I also did it at the American Bible Society headquarters in New York City. Because there they have this incredible collection of pocket Bibles. A soldier couldn't be running around carrying a Bible of this size. So early on, the American Bible Society and then the Confederate Bible Society decided they would print pocket versions of the Bible, or sometimes the Gospel of John or the Psalms or Proverbs, and the soldier could carry it that way. When the Battle of Gettysburg was over, there were 50,000 dead, wounded, and missing soldiers. 6,000 Union and Confederate dead lay on the field. And as they struggled to get the place prepared for this First National Military Cemetery and the ceremony that would take place in November, they gathered all of the belongings of all of the soldiers, pocket watches, jewelry, money, photographs, and they categorized them so that parents, wives, could come and collect them. What they chiefly found were Bibles. Every soldier carried a Bible. And if you're in New York and can go to the American Bible Society, you will see in these Bibles, almost every single one of them, the soldier puts his life verse at the beginning of the Bible. It's just remarkable. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, but then Lincoln's punctuation, which is often changed in the internet, I'm glad this hasn't been changed, there's a semicolon. And he offers a strange and interesting sentence, and each invokes his aid against the other. What begins as an affirmation, both read the same Bible, ends, although it's not grammatically a question, it really is a question, how dare people invoke God's aid against the other? Lincoln had become, frankly, quite tired of delegations of ministers who were coming to him to say, God is on our side, God is on our side. And he knew the same different delegations of ministers were coming to Jefferson Davis to say, God is on our side, God is on our side. And what Lincoln is saying, what you're suggesting here is that God is a tribal God who takes sides in this. This is a Christian nation. How can God take sides? I think God's in agony over this. And so he's portraying a much larger, inclusive God. And then he invokes the first Bible verse. Now, I looked in preparing my first book, Lincoln's Greatest Speech, for the antecedents of this address. Most addresses you can find that someone in Poughkeepsie or Paducah or Pocatello or somewhere has tried it out before. Whether it's, I bet, Barack Obama or George Bush or President Clinton or Martin Luther King, they try out an idea, and if it works well, they bring it into the State of the Union address or into the inaugural address. But you can't find any of the antecedents of the second inaugural in any previous speeches, but you find it in two significant places. 3 months to the day before Lincoln delivered this address, 2 women were ushered into his office. Lincoln just saw everybody. He called these visits his public opinion baths. He wanted to know what ordinary people thought. Well, these 2 women were from the South, and their husbands were Confederate officers now confined in a Union prison. And so they knew that Lincoln was a real softy. When women came to him, especially with their tears, he just signed pardon after pardon after pardon for the boy who fell asleep on sentry duty, the man who refused to fight. He said in one order that he gave to the general, I think this man would be better above ground than below ground. And the man went on to win the Medal of Honor. So Lincoln, these women said, our husbands are religious men. So Lincoln listened and talked to them, and then he said, would you come back tomorrow? Let's continue the conversation. Boy, they must have been surprised. And after the second day, he invited them back for a third day. But on the third day, he said to them, I find it very difficult when you tell me your husbands are religious men. How can religious men go against the duly constituted authority of this land? And then from memory, here's the line right below it, this is Genesis 3:19, for those of you that didn't know. It seems strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. For the Bible that we hold as an authority is simply not there and then in the past. It must become for us here and now in the present. And this is what Lincoln is saying. Your husbands are involved in getting their bread from the sweat of other men's labor. And then he said to these 2 women, this is not the kind of religion that gets people to heaven. And he let the women out of his office, and Noah Brooks was sitting out in the hallway, and he said, Noah, come on in here. I want to write down this interview with these two women. I may want to use it someday. 3 months to the day, he brings it right into the second inaugural address. But notice the semicolon again. I think when Lincoln wrote this, he said to himself, this sounds pretty harsh. This sounds pretty judgmental. And so very quickly he writes, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. Matthew 7:5, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is offering a new ethic based in mercy and compassion. The original title of my book was to be Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount, because that's what some of the newspaper reporters called it. But my New York publisher would hear nothing of it. She said, no, we're going to call it Lincoln's Greatest Speech. She said, that's sexier. I said, sexier? She said, yes. She said, they'll all think it's the Gettysburg Address, and then we'll, So Lincoln balances this judgment, as it were, against these women and their husbands and the whole notion of what they're about with Jesus' wonderful words of the Sermon on the Mount. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. And then Lincoln offers what I call the central sentence, the central theological affirmation of the entire address. The Almighty has His own purposes. And of course, at this point, I'm still having in the back of my mind the charge or the criticism that I've heard 1,000 times. Well, maybe this is only the words of a shrewd politician. How do we know that there's integrity or conviction here? Well, central in my biography is the image that I want the audience to see. And this is the way that Lincoln defined himself, defined ideas, and ultimately redefined America. He would take little scraps of paper, sometimes the back of a flap of an envelope, and he would write out his thinking. Often he began with a problem, the problem of slavery, or the problem of the Dred Scott decision, or his decision whether he should enter the new Republican Party. Once in 1856, at a moment of his depression, I think, or certainly sadness, he had lost a bid for the Senate in 1855 to his erstwhile rival, Stephen Douglas of Illinois. And in this little note, he never thought any of us would see any of these notes. These were written for his eyes only, and he stuffed them in the top of his hat or the bottom of his drawer, and they were found, almost all of them, after his death. So he writes on this little scrap of paper all the incredible accomplishments. You can hear the envy in this of Stephen Douglas. He's now United States Senator, almost the Democratic candidate for president in 1856 of the Democratic Party. And at the end of the note, Lincoln writes, my life is nothing but a flat failure. My life is nothing but a flat failure. Well, sometime in the middle of the Civil War, in what was in many ways a private journey of faith, Lincoln takes out another scrap of paper. I traveled to Brown University to see this scrap of paper. It's unlined, and it's lined, and it's undated. I want to read it for you. I can read it in about 75 seconds. I suspect it took Lincoln 4 or 5 hours to write it, because he's asking the most amazing question of all: where is God in the midst of the Civil War? For the second inaugural it begins to be about the soldiers, the generals, the commander-in-chief. But when Lincoln says the Almighty has His own purposes, he is now telling us God is the central actor in this war. But how do we know that this is not simply the words of a shrewd politician? Because he wrote these words for his eyes only: the will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. And then this profound sentence: in the present civil war, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. Do you hear what he's saying there? It's the eternal question that you've asked yourself, or those perhaps outside the faith have challenged you with. Well, how can there be free will and God's will? It's kind of like the Puritans who said, praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. This is what Lincoln is saying. God's will is what's working in the war, and yet God is using what he calls human instrumentalities. I'm almost ready to say, this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet. It's his job to end it. But he's saying in private, and it shall not end yet. By his mere quiet power. Oh, I love that description of God. By his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants. My wife tells me, do not become emotional when you read these things. He could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. Yet the contest proceeds. My point in reading this is not to say that I think we're able to come up with a precise definition of the theological beliefs of Abraham Lincoln, but that Lincoln is here wrestling with deep theological questions of faith. This is a man of faith who's on a journey. Oh, I wish he would have lived because he was just announcing his faith at the beginning of his second term. Gamblers in the street were betting he'd be inaugurated for a third term and would serve till March 1873. And I'm convinced that the story of our nation, certainly the story of the relationship between the South and the North, would have been incredibly different if he had lived with his great reconciling spirit. Lincoln now does something very unusual in inaugural addresses. Woe unto the world because of offenses. He's now quoting again from Matthew. For it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. I'm sure all the students here will know that this sounds very much like a Puritan Jeremiad. The early Puritans in the second, third, and fourth generation, as the preachers were aware that those generations were forgetting the faith of the founding parents, they would speak to the congregations and say, God has a complaint against us. We have become immoral. We have forgotten God's way. We have forsaken the way of truth. So Lincoln is saying the same thing. Woe unto the world because of offenses. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses. Now, whenever you listen to a politician or a preacher or a professor, you need to be aware of what the person doesn't say as well as what the person does say. We've all witnessed the inauguration of Barack Obama and the incredible emotional outpouring. Oh, when I came to this second inaugural, I thought that would be the same. It was totally different. In the letters and diaries of the people who were there that day, there was not exhilaration, there was anger. They were deeply angry. Every person there would have lost a father, husband, son, brother, and they were angry at the South. And they wanted Lincoln to express their anger, or they wanted at least for him to claim a kind of triumphal vision. He had been reelected. He refused to do either. Rather, he suggests not slavery. If he'd have said that, the crowd would have erupted in cheers because they would have assumed he meant the South. He very self-consciously says, American slavery. We are all involved in this. Do not point your finger at the South. This is an American problem. It's been so from the beginning, and we have to solve it together. In Lincoln's tenure, the only person ever put to death for being a slave owner, Lincoln put to death. The man's wife came twice to plead for his life. Lincoln listened to her twice and rejected her plea. He was from Rhode Island because the slave ships often sailed out of New England. And he let the sentence go forward that the man would be hung to death because he was the owner of a slave ship. Inaugural addresses, if you think about it, are usually pretty self-congratulatory. We're such a wonderful nation, and I'm such a wonderful president. But Lincoln is saying we have a great problem in the midst of our nation. It is the problem of slavery, and we need to address it and deal with it. This is a moral universe, and what we have done we must pay for. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove. Do you hear those active verbs? This is a providential God. This is not a fatalistic God. Shall we discern, and that he gives to both North and South, this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departures from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and then these incredible images, until every drop of blood drawn with a lash, slavery, shall be paid by another drawn with a sword, 623,000 dead, as many as all of our wars put together. How many dead have we had in Iraq? It would be as if there were 5 million dead in Iraq if we take the tiny nation of Lincoln's day and make it coefficient to the large nation of our day, as if we had 5 million dead in the last 4 or 5 years. I was in a tiny village in Vermont, and recently they said, we've got to do a better job of telling what happened. 27 boys marched out of that village. Three returned. 24 were killed in that war. And you could take villages in the south and the north, and the same thing would be true. Yet if God wills, this is a willing God. Lincoln concludes the paragraph with a wonderful quotation from Psalm 19. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. We need to draw to a close. Let me draw this illustration of Lincoln's public use of the Bible together. You see, it isn't simply by saying the Bible, the Bible, the Bible, but the Bible contains the story of God's revelation, of God's action in history. In a sense, the Bible almost points beyond itself, and Lincoln is reading the Bible here to read and discern how God acts in history. Reporter for the New York Herald said there were only 4 occasions of applause in this address. People were not exactly sure what was happening. This wasn't at all what they expected. He was going to declare his policy, and he doesn't do any of that. But the reporter for the Times of London, sometimes foreign observers see things better than those of us who are close, said there was another response in the crowd. It was from people who were in the back of the crowd. They'd never been to an inauguration before. And the reporter for the Times of London strained at first to hear what they were saying, but then the words became clear. Bless the Lord, bless the Lord, bless the Lord. The African Americans took up the chant, bless the Lord, bless the Lord, bless the Lord. They understood what Lincoln was saying. Frederick Douglass, the greatest African American of the day, wrote in his journal that evening, this was not a state paper, this was a sermon. Well, you and I have been to lots of sermons. And the sermon, whether we understand it or not, is usually the first 3/4 or so is what I would like to call the indicative, where the preacher announces what God does in history, primarily through the life, teaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But then at the end of the service, the minister is going to somehow say, and in the coming week, you therefore should. The first 3 paragraphs of this address are the indicative. The Almighty has His own purposes. And the Bible is not ornament, it's not illustration, it's absolutely foundational to what God is doing right now in the Civil War. But to really understand the last paragraph, we need to insert almost an unvoiced therefore. Therefore, with malice toward none, with charity for all. I think Lincoln must have thought long and hard before he wrote the last paragraph. Was it possible, he must have asked himself, that a nation so deeply divided, so filled with hatred, brother fighting hatred in this awful war, could come together again in forgiveness and reconciliation? But isn't that what the indicative is all about? God's offering to us forgiveness, God calling us to be reconciled with each other simply because of who He is, not because of who we are. And so Lincoln offers these words that transcend time. They come into the 21st century with malice toward none, with charity for all. I want to suggest that we say these words out loud. Lincoln always read out loud. He said that to read out loud was to read with two senses, the eye and the ear. He read out loud to the consternation of his law partner, Willie Herndon. I say to students, read your papers out loud and you'll better be able to hear what they are, or have a roommate read your paper out loud to you. And so only when we read these out, the hearing of the Word of God, this is, we can read the Word of God, but we need to hear the Word of God. This is where we will sense the power of what Lincoln is asking us. Let's say this last paragraph very softly, not softly, slowly. He spoke so slowly, much more slowly than we do. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Why should we still be talking about Abraham Lincoln in the year 2009? There are great figures of politics, history, and literature which we should teach in our classroom, but there's almost no one whose words still transcend time. Somehow we never can get enough of Lincoln. Perhaps we've seen him, sadly, only as a caricature, or perhaps we reverence him because we walked up the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, but we need to understand more about him. And in terms of our topic of the evening, Lincoln and the Bible, Lincoln reminds us that yes, the Bible is there and then. It was founded in a very special time of history, and we honor that, and we honor the Bible's authority. But if the Bible is really to be authoritative, it needs to be here and now. It needs to challenge us, ask us questions, intersect our lives, and become part of the way we live. And so with all of the hoopla about Abraham Lincoln in 2009, what I'm privileged to talk with you about tonight is the topic that isn't talked about very much, Lincoln's journey of faith, and the way that the Bible and Lincoln can become a treasure for those who want to name the name of Christ. Thank you. A few minutes. We have a few minutes for comments and questions. If you will make a comment or question, I'll repeat it so that everyone can hear. Be happy to. Yes, sir. Good question. Did Lincoln have a speechwriter? We know that all modern presidents have multiple speechwriters. No. There were two occasions when he showed his speeches to other people. And one occasion, which I do in my usual stump speech, where he showed his inaugural address to William Seward, his chief rival for the presidency, and then his Secretary of State. And Seward told him to forget his last paragraph. Here, I've written you two new ones. You choose which one you want to use. And Lincoln chooses one of those paragraphs, and then I show in my biography how Lincoln takes Seward's words, which are good ideas, and transforms his words into prose poetry by his deft revising. Right? Yes? Well, I don't have any text here. It's being recorded, is it? It's being recorded. Yeah, I don't have it. I'm not delivering a lecture. I'm just talking with you. Yes. Right. A very good question. Is it true that Lincoln said one time to the Secretary of Education, I think, Superintendent of Education in Illinois, I would join a church if they would put over their altar Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, self, and your neighbor as yourself. I struggled long and hard. I don't have that story in my biography. It's one of those difficult questions of reminiscence. I believe that it's 60 to 65% that it's true. It's been challenged by others. Maybe it's challenged because we don't want Lincoln to say those things. I'm not sure. It's hard to say. It's not backed up by anybody else. It's possible. Yes. Yes. Wonderful comment. The last 4 words of the address, and with all nations. I thought for a long time this is a throwaway line. Until one day a fellow walked into my office, another scholar at the Huntington Library, and said, I want to show you this. And he said, here's a communication from a representative of the United States in France back to Secretary of State Seward, in which the French press said they absolutely loved this address and they especially liked the last line. And I said, what? We had been in a real tussle with France because they had been occupying Mexico. And we told them we didn't like that. So the French people were worried that once this nation settled its civil war, there would be gunboats coming up the Seine to attack France. And in a sense, the French heard these words as an olive branch. That Lincoln is sort of saying, Lincoln understood that democracy was not just for the United States, this was for the whole world, and we had no imperial or expansionist designs. He had voted against the war with Mexico, and we were not going to be an expansionist nation taking on other nations once we got ourselves together. I never thought about that, but this is the way the French people read these last 4 words. This was an olive branch to them. Yes? Well, here I'm embarrassed. I will see it this summer, I think, but there is a Bible that he used at his birthplace at Hodgenville, Kentucky, and he did take notes. That's the way, and he did write in the margins, and he may have had more than one Bible. The other wonderful story is that Joshua Speed, who I mentioned, in Lincoln's deepest bout of depression when he had been separated from Mary Todd for more than a year, their engagement broken off, Joshua invited him to come and spend some time at his home in Louisville, Farmington. And while he was there, Mrs. Speed, Joshua's mother, came and presented to Abraham Lincoln a King James Bible. And she encouraged him to read the Bible. She said, this is what you need at this difficult moment in your life. Well, 20 years later, in 1861, when Lincoln became the president, his mother, an older woman now, wrote and asked whether it might be possible that Lincoln could send her a photograph of himself. He wrote the photograph and he said, and this is to the dear woman who 20 years ago presented to me a copy of the King James Bible. So he had more than one Bible. Yeah. Yes? Good question. How do you reconcile Lincoln's faith and Mary dabbling in the occult? Mary had 8 or 9 sessions in the White House, seances, where in her troubled spirit, she believed she could communicate with Willie or she could communicate with Eddie. And she invited Abraham to come. He came one time, and he had to tell her he could not participate in this. He did not believe in this. And you can imagine, though, his role, if this somehow brought her comfort, and yet he could not participate in this. Yes, way in the back. Yes. A very, very good question. How do we understand Lincoln's relationship to slavery, his struggle with slavery? On the one hand, as you suggest, and you can find this in the debates with Stephen Douglas, Lincoln speaks of African Americans as inferior. Certainly they are not social equals. And yet on the other hand, he changes the focus and purpose of the war to not simply be saving the Union, but to freeing the slaves and issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. A story. 3 men from Kentucky came to see him at the end of March 1863. It included the governor. The governor, Thomas Bramlett, was very upset with Lincoln. He'd written him 4 letters and said, "Don't you realize that by recruiting blacks in Kentucky to serve in the Union Army, you're absolutely depopulating the farms of Kentucky and destroying our agriculture? I want a meeting with you." So Lincoln met with him for 2.5 hours on a Saturday morning, and he began with these words: "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. But immediately after that," he said, "but I have never conceived that it was my prerogative to act on my own personal wishes. Rather," and I can't complete the quote, "he was the head of a government in which the Constitution did not give him the right to deal with slavery where it already existed in the South." That was part of the dilemma. In one of the debates, the 4th debate at Charleston, Lincoln began, and this has often been quoted by African American authors in the last 25 years who wish to depict Lincoln as a racist. And so he begins by saying, "It is not that I'm going to marry a black woman." Well, that wasn't possible. "It's not that I believe blacks should serve on juries. It's not, but listen, what's going on here? What does a debater do? A debater concedes. A lawyer does that too in presenting his case. And Lincoln then says, "But this black woman," and he chooses a woman, not a man, "this black woman in her right to earn the bread from her own hands is every bit my equal." And I think he paused at this point and looked out on the audience and says, "and the equal of every person here, because," and he quotes Jefferson, "all men are created equal." Well, one day he was asked the question, well, if the founders said all men are created equal, they obviously didn't treat all men being equal. He said, they're not all equal in all things. And this is where he would say they were not socially equal. But then he went on to say this: "It is just like what Jesus said." Another great untruth is that Lincoln never mentions Jesus. It's just like what Jesus said, "Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." Lincoln says Jesus did not believe we are perfect. It is rather that we should strive to be perfect. So Lincoln is a person of his own time. If I were teaching a class, I think I actually have been tonight, and I had a blackboard or a whiteboard behind me, I would draw a line and I would say, where is Lincoln on the spectrum of racial thinking about race in Illinois? And I think we, the members of our class, would have to conclude he was left of center. He wasn't way to the left. He wasn't an abolitionist. He thought they were too self-righteous. And he certainly wasn't to the right. And on the national political scene, he would be left of center. So Lincoln said one day, I have to have God on my side. I would like to have God on my side, but I need Kentucky. He was a politician. He had to have the 4 border states. If those border states had decided to join the Confederacy, the war would have been over and the Confederacy would have won. So he had to hold his punches. He offered colonization as a scheme, which is hard for us to understand. Finally, in the early July of 1862, he gathered the 4 border states together and he says, listen, I'm going to give you a deal you can't resist. I'll pay for every single one of your slaves, and I'll pay all the way up till 1895. You can take 40 years, 30 years to emancipate your slaves if you wish. They said, no deal. Lincoln said, okay, you got the best offer you're ever going to get. And he went back to the soldiers' home and finished his draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a complicated question. You ask a good question. Yes? Hard to see in the lights.
Could you comment for us on your feelings, given your background, your years of study, this particular subject? Does your view mesh with
Well, the question is, your statement is that there was no other man who could have done what Lincoln did. God put him in this place for such a time as this. Doris Kearns Goodwin, in her fine book, Team of Rivals, talks about all of the other leaders who start out thinking they're all better than Lincoln, and Lincoln becomes the person who they most admire. You can't think of anybody else who could have done what Lincoln did, who had the combination of this deep moral center, who was respectful of people with other positions in his own, who spoke out of a position of humility. His last two speeches, the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural, I argue, he literally disappears. There's not one personal pronoun in the Gettysburg Address. There's only two in the Second Inaugural. Can you imagine a modern politician speaking a speech without using the word I about 73 times? The real question then becomes, what would have happened if Lincoln lived? And obviously what he faced was very difficult, but I think the South, I hope, would have seen that he wasn't this caricature of the black Republican, but he was a man who understood them and wanted to offer conciliation. I think the whole history of our country would have been quite different. Diana, thank you very much.